All right, welcome everyone and good morning. My name is Judith Beyer. I'm a professor of social and cultural anthropology at the University of Konstanz in Germany. And I'm here for a month on a fellowship with the HSS, giving a series of lectures in Paris. This is my fourth and last one. On the one hand, I'm a bit sad because it means I have to leave soon. On the other hand, I'm looking forward to getting back to writing my book, which is not on Central Asia, but on Southeast Asia, on Myanmar. But today, for the sake of your workshop here, I'm going back to my material on Central Asia. And I've taken up the challenge of thinking about narratives once more. And I just realized that there's a connection between what I've been doing in Konstanz and what you're trying to do with Casio. Because when Bota talked about the anthropological perspective and the possibility of decentering narratives for the case of Central Asia, she had just come back from a workshop which I have organized in Konstanz, which was called The Future of Central Asian Studies, where we presented only monographs that had been published within the last 2 years, so basically between 2016 and 2017. And we invited all of the authors of these monographs. Everyone had read every other person's monograph, and we had a really good in-depth discussion, which is completely online as well. So if you go to the homepage of the University of Konstanz, to my homepage, you will find links to the complete discussions we've had. And I just realized, I mean, this might be something of interest to the Wikistan page also. So if you want to, I could hand over these audio files and video files also. Because one of my aims, as much as Stefan has emphasized, is also to promote Central Asian studies as a discipline in its own right, that I think is really important for various kinds of reasons. So there's a connection between what we did in Konstanz in 2017 and what you've been trying to do in Berlin and now in Paris, and I'm very happy to be part of that. In this keynote, I engage with the conference topic of challenging or even disturbing grand narratives through an investigation of the tradition of orality and the usage of oral history in Central Asia. These are two interlinked endeavors, I argue, as oral tradition has been investigated as history and oral history has been understood as the voice from the past. Anthropologists of Central Asia, but also in general, investigate tradition as a site of necessary engagement that aggregates people, informs policy, public debates, law, and representation, and is, despite its often enough strategic inception, effectively powerful. And again, I'm shamelessly self-promoting a forthcoming special issue in Central Asian Survey, which I'm co-editing with Peter Finke from the University of Zurich, which is on practices of traditionalization. So we're again taking up this phenomenon of what does it mean to have or be witness to ongoing traditionalization in Central Asia for the actors themselves. Yeah. Examples from Central Asia show how oral tradition, especially when mediated by state and media apparatus, can take on grand narrative qualities. Moreover, in contrast to how oral history has been treated in the past, namely as a history from below or from the everyday, or a history by the little guys, as David Graeber calls our informants in anthropology, thus as little narrative, as I will call it, it is worth exploring in what ways this method of ethnographic and historical inquiry has the capacity to yield grand results. So what I'm trying to do in this keynote is to contemplate a bit the relation between what I call little narratives and grand narratives, because I think there is a relation, and this directly will speak to what Florian Koppenrath just mentioned, namely what can we as scholars working in Central Asia, very often with people who one could consider or who are considered marginal, what can we contribute to these big debates? Yeah. So this keynote is about the role of oral history in creating little and grand narratives, the latter being the topic of this workshop. But it is also a reflection about method and methodology in anthropological and historical field research and the role oral history has come to play. It is finally a reflection about why anthropologists and historians who are engaging with contemporary societies should be thinking about oral history more and what they should be doing when they carry out field research, namely listening. Listening is the other side of narration, as narratives must be narrated to someone first. That is, they must be listened to. And very often this listener is us. Listening is different from hearing. It is an active process which consists of recognizing, understanding, interpreting, remembering, and reacting towards that which has been heard. If the source of that which you're listening to is a human being, a range of other things can be added to this list, which influence the way we are listening, namely behavior, body language, for example. Also the place one is at, participating objects such as the furniture you're sitting on, the food you're consuming, the drinks you're being offered, the presence of other people who might be listening in, all of this makes listening a very complex endeavor. Finally, your own disposition towards what you're hearing. So listening is a social practice, and as such has not been explicitly dealt with in general anthropology, quite in contrast to other disciplines, for example, sociolinguistics or psycholinguistics, for example, but also in psychology. In acoustic phonetics, we deal with amplitudes, with intensity, and with frequencies. In American linguistic anthropology, we deal with the study of speech and language. More generally, a methodological investigation of the art of listening, as the title of a well-known book by psycholinguists McGregor and White is called, has been lagging behind studies on communication, on speech acts, or the ethnography of speaking. And before I delve into oral history more specifically, let me offer some reflections on ethnographic methods in this wider sense. And to everyone who has an anthropological background, this is of course very familiar, but to others this might be important to keep in mind. The heart of anthropological fieldwork is of course participant observation, which consists of participation and observation. The invention of this method is usually credited to Bronisław Malinowski, a Polish ethnographer who worked at the LSE, but de facto this method had been practiced prior to his research in the Trobriand Islands. The concept had been coined first in anthropology in 1940 by Florence Kluckhohn, but in sociology it had been used already in 1924 by Lindemann, although not in the sense it's being used today. For Lindemann, a participant observer is a member of a group who would convey the perspective of the group to the researcher. You would call this person today a middleman or a broker. But Malinowski had been the first researcher who consequently and reflexively used this method in Melanesia. Participant observation consists of a researcher, an ethnographer, usually living for a continuous time in one place, together with people, speaking their language, and observing as much as participating in their daily activities. The establishing of a relationship of trust is the necessary predicament for such a kind of expansive and time-consuming method, which often produces huge amounts of data, albeit of a very different kind compared to those generated from standardized interviews. No questionnaires are usually filled out, no tests are being made. The researcher is rather her own toolkit, and it is through her presence in the field, amongst others, that data can evolve. It is for these reasons that participant observation is often negatively characterized as not being a method at all, as it does produce not reliable data in the sense of objective and quantifiable, and thus representational. However, it has remained paradigmatic for anthropology, and rightly so. There have been two changes in the last decades within anthropological fieldwork. One is the fact that anthropology has come home, which means that increasingly we research our own societies. The other one is a change in methods itself, away from participant observation and towards increasing reliance on interviews and shorter field research, in contrast to the classical one-year stay. So anthropology is somehow becoming similar or more similar to other disciplines such as sociology or political science, where at the same time ethnography is becoming more and more en vogue. So nowadays everyone who is working in the social sciences calls himself or herself an ethnographer. The German anthropologist Gerd Spittler has criticized this development already in an article written in 2001, in which he argues for a radicalization of participant observation, calling it thick participation. The term is obviously a composite of participant observation and Clifford Geertz's thick description. Thick, in the sense Spittler uses the term, means first of all social proximity and the joint experience of everyday life. Why is this necessary? Spittler argues that knowledge is often not verbally shared, but tacit knowledge, a term which he borrows from Polanyi. Often people are not capable or willing or allowed to share knowledge verbally, so that asking does not help. Only a second kind of socialization will do, which means de facto you might be becoming a child to your classificatory parents in the field. You might be becoming an apprentice to a master in order to learn the skills of others by practicing them yourself. You might even become a shaman or a witch, to cite one of the most classical examples of anthropological initiation rites. Thick participation, according to Spittler, consists of apprenticeship and practice, but also of observation and communication. He notes that observation, just as participation, has decreased in anthropological research, where the anthropologist has come to ask more and more questions instead. But in contrast to the natural sciences, where observations are made quantifiable and definable, even though nowadays being critically deconstructed by science and technology studies, anthropological observations often concentrate in random moments, in situations, which provide diagnostic avenues into complex phenomenon. As an anthropologist, especially when we're working in other societies than our own, we first need to be able to see these as worth noting. These observations, once we've learned what there is to see, need to be enriched by listening to what people have to say. And here it is of utmost importance to differentiate the following, namely what people say they are doing, what people say they should be doing, and what people are doing. These are very different things, and they get mixed up very easily. Spittler expands his concept of thick participation by adding sensual experiences, such as emotional closeness to the people we're working with, direct experience of their everyday lives. However, he does not problematize that our informants too often no longer live their lives in rural areas and on the literal fields where sharing of time and space is unproblematic. They too work in offices and travel. They lead multi-local lives and are under time constraints. Thus, the paradigmatic hanging out and bringing up a topic of anthropological field research needs to be adapted to these new circumstances by means of what Hockey has called hanging in. Interestingly, Spittler does not talk about the possibility of listening in what I otherwise find a convincing analysis, both of anthropology as a discipline and the constraints we're working under. However, in the last years, there have been several initiatives to refocus on the techniques of listening. Meyer and Shareika, for example, argue for what they call participant audition. The argument being here as well that it is through listening that we can gain novel kinds of access to our informants' worlds of meaning-making, which we would miss if we only participate or only ask questions. The subtitle of their article reads, "Audio Recording as Ethnographic Method." It is thus concerned with new technical possibilities to produce audio records that could be used also in general anthropological and historical research, not only in linguistic anthropology or conversation analysis, where you need exact transcripts. The authors are concerned with the systematization of gathering data by means of audio recordings, but not so much with how this body of data gets interpreted once it has been recorded. Similarly to Meyer and Shareika, Gerard Forsey suggested an article to engage in what he calls participant listening. More generally, he argues that the equation of anthropology with ethnography and ethnography with participant observation no longer holds true for reasons which I just discussed. His argument is not that we should focus more on listening instead of observing, as these things always go together. Instead, he takes issue with the fact that what is being heard in research, conversations, songs, speeches, and so on, has up to date not been classified as listening, but as talk. Just as Spittler and Meyer and Scharaika, Forsey remarks that we're living what he calls in an interview society, taking the term from Silverman. The interview itself has become a form of participant observation. And he pleads for participant listening as part of an interview situation. This approach intersects with the development within the sociology of interaction, the so-called active interviewing. Active interviewing takes issue with more conservative types of interviewing, such as survey interviewing, for example, where, to put it very bluntly, informants are regarded as reservoirs of knowledge that they can actively access and reproduce their knowledge in communication. Thus, the only thing an interviewer has to do, if you carry out a sort of survey interviewing, is to tap into this reservoir of knowledge and extract the knowledge and take it home with you. Yeah. How do you do this? By asking really smart questions, and then you get all kinds of hints in these publications. For example, you should start with what and not with why, because it's about the form, not the content. Active interviewing, however, very much differs from survey interviewing. It also differs from another version of interviewing, which is usually referred to as creative interviewing. Creative interviewing has the predisposition that informants often do not rationally talk about their life histories or their own past, but are very emotional, and it's about getting access to these emotions and affects, and the interviewer has to use creative ways in order to tap into this knowledge. But the process of extracting knowledge out of an informant is the same. Yeah? So it's a unilateral, hierarchical, very technical kind of process that is behind. In contrast to these two types of interviewing, active interviewing is concerned more with understanding how, in the course of a conversation, meaning is generated. What type of information an informant chooses to reveal, or how he or she shares this information, and how, in a process of co-emergence, knowledge is being produced. So active interviewing is concerned with conversation and not the unilateral transfer of knowledge, and it is concerned with co-emergent interpretations and understanding how we come to certain statements. So now, taking all of this to the topic of oral history and narratives, my impression from how oral history is being employed in both disciplines of history and anthropology is that it continues to rely on a rather conservative model of interviewing in order to get at people's narratives. Most tutorials concentrate on learning how to ask the right questions, on technical know-how, on cultivating a restrained stance towards the interviewee, on the art of archiving the data, and on the many ways of sharing the data. Questions of co-emergence, of power inequalities, and of reciprocity are asked mostly only in feminist oral history research. But here too we find also mostly the urge to study marginalized people or minorities. In an edited volume on the history of oral history, an overview of the development of the method ends with the following sentence. But the basic dynamic, two people sitting and talking about the past, has remained largely unchanged. Despite the sophistication of analysis and interpretation, a middle school student can still do a legitimate oral history interview. Where individuals communicate, oral history will continue to be useful. I do not want to dispute this statement, but I want you to alert to the fact that within ethnographic fieldwork there are other ways of contextualizing people's narratives about their past that go beyond and do not rely on interviewing. I argue that within ethnographic oral history research, neither the content, so the what question, nor the form, the how question, is necessarily the most important thing to consider. First of all, what we need to consider is the context in which we are listening to another person talk about their past or their own personal history. Local representations of history are always embedded in social contexts. If you are at the right place at the right time, you will not need to schedule an interview in order to learn about an important narrative. Listening thus does not only mean not talking. It also means signaling that you do not know yet and that you want to learn. It means that not only are you acknowledging somebody else as an expert, but you're also willing to assume the position of a pupil. It is not that you're giving the word to someone so that that person may narrate something for you. You don't even have the power to grant another person the space. You will be assigned the role of a listener. You're being talked to, something is being narrated at you and for you, and your duty is to listen. And I learned this the very hard way. This is Graeber, one of my key informants from rural Kyrgyzstan. I was painfully being made aware of this crucial difference during my fieldwork in Central Asia when the head of the Aksakal court, the local court of elders in a mountain village in northern Kyrgyzstan where I did my field research, told me to stop asking questions and listen. I am not a parrot, he said. This was interesting because parrots are known for only repeating what they've been taught. They don't come up with their own talk. They reproduce already existing talk they have been trained to repeat. Thus I understood if I wanted to learn something new, something I had not already known from reading a lot of books, I needed to stop asking questions. I did research in a classical rural Central Asian setting where after a while I knew everyone in my neighborhood. Research was possible only in Kyrgyz language as people had cultivated throughout the Union a deep mistrust against Russian language and outsiders, while at the same time cultivating a very strong sense of self. This was revealed to me also in the way they portrayed the history of the Soviet Union, namely often diametrically opposed to what we know from the history books. For example, their statements about Kyrgyz customary law, which I was interested in mostly as I was pursuing a PhD in legal anthropology. Only in the middle of my field research I understood that the continuous reinvention of local customary law, locally called SALT, was not only a rhetorical strategy to position oneself against other fellow villagers with whom one had a dispute, but also it was a way to elevate one's own law in contrast to state law and religious law. In the local terminology, SALT has the capacity to swallow jutu, non-customary legal repertoires, such as Sharia and state law. SALT often gets portrayed as something more important, more encompassing, more just. I cannot go into further detail here, but this is basically what my book, The Force of Custom, is about. I mentioned already that the social context in which history acquires importance and is narrated is important. Before I start engaging with where these possible contexts might be, I would like to remind you of where local history usually gets exhibited in rural Central Asia, namely in village and school museums. Those local museums are a Soviet institution that continues to exist, but they are rarely frequented. The material objects exhibited there are often handmade, and next to genealogies and biographies, you will find portraits, photographs of villagers, important textual documents, visualizations, and different versions of official village histories presented side by side. It is in these places that history gets exhibited, but it is being told and listened to elsewhere. For example, during life cycle rituals, such as the beginning of spring, Noruz, or a Tülö, a ritual where members of different lineages ask God, Khudai, for rain in order to reap a rich harvest in autumn. It is on these occasions that the topic of ancestry, of genealogy, of village history is being raised naturally among the villagers themselves. Descent, and I'm taking descent here in this keynote as one of the grand narratives of Central Asia, particularly of Kyrgyzstan. Descent, which is a very abstract, very theoretical concept. Descent is here being discussed in the context of ritual practice, and it is by means of participating, observing, and listening that its relevance can be grasped. Who belongs to a lineage and who does not get answered not in the abstract, but in the concrete. Who sits and eats together? Who shares stories? Who has given the animals which are being slaughtered? And so on. How was it in the past? Why did it change? It was through this spring ritual that I understood other highly abstract concepts such as Sanjira and Uru that have dominated much writing on Kyrgyzstan, a country that is often portrayed as being clan-based. But what does that mean? There was thus no need to ask about these things as they were revealed in the course of the ritual gathering itself. The key is to find those moments in time and space where suddenly a grand narrative is being revealed through seemingly mundane interactions and many little narratives. What becomes obvious in these events is that there's rarely a shared version of a narrative to which everyone can agree. More often, people are disputing about the course of events and the meaning of certain elements of a narrative. What I also found out during this particular ritual here was that, again, in contrast to how the literature had up-to-date been discussed, namely the issue of tribalism, a construct that can be mobilized in terms of political campaigning, these dissent groups, they do not only exist in narration. So it's not only an abstract concept. Why is it not an abstract concept only? Because, for example, at this ritual, I found out for the first time that there's a commonly owned pool of household items which do not belong to households but to the lineage as such. So there's common property directly related to the category of the lineage, which is being pooled for the occasion of these rituals, and that hadn't been discussed in the literature before. And it only came out because I was participating in eating out of these huge bowls, yeah? And each of these bowls had a little hole, so someone had punched a hole in each of the bowls, and I realized these holes, and I said, what are the holes for? And people said, this is to indicate that these bowls do not belong to a household, but they belong to Burgu Uru. So it was Uru property, yes? Like a category that as such has not been known in the literature before. That's how I found out. What you can see here on this map is that the lower village in which I did field research, Aral, is divided into two main lineages. The upper lineage is colored red, the lower one colored purple, and you can also see that this color is the same as in the second village where I did field research. So basically there's a sharing of a lineage across two villages, and then the largest part of Aral belonging to another one. During the spring ritual, the descent line had split into sub-lineages, here shown as 4 different groups, and I hope you can see the numbers on the map. And I spent the entire day at the riverbank, going from one group to the other, learning as much as I could by listening and participating in this feast. One important topic of conversation was the newly erected statue of Burgu Batır at the entrance of the village, right at the main road, thus visible for all passers-by on the way to the regional town of Talas, which is about 40 kilometers away from my field site. Burgu Batır is the ancestor of the Burgu lineage, by now 8 generations removed. The statue is just one example among many examples of retraditionalization and the invention of the history of the Kyrgyz since the country gained independence in 1991. And you all probably know that the Kyrgyz have an elaborate oral culture and that the Manas epic in particular is famous. It deals with the life history of the father of all Kyrgyz, as he is often called, Manas, and his extended family, his wife Kanike, his son Semete, as well as a lot of stories about war and conquest. Now, Talas, the area where I did my field research, is regarded as the cradle of Manas, so the place of his birth and the place of his reign. In Manas Ordo, which is the complex which you see here, it's a large outdoor area, you can become witness to his life, for example, by climbing the hill from which he looked out for foreign warriors, by visiting his alleged grave and mausoleum, by entering a museum that is filled with devotional items and material objects, all telling the story of his life. This is a history in the making. New artifacts are being added to the museum display every now and then. And I'm visiting this place every time I go back to Kyrgyzstan, paying particular attention to the kind of narrative that is being told at the specific moment in time. Just to give you one example, this painting on the right lower picture is interesting. It shows 7 wise men on the way to Manas's palace, and you can see the resemblance between the way the palace looks in the painting and the way the museum has been built in which this painting is exhibited. Yeah? So you see 7 white-bearded men on the way to Manas's palace. When I visited the place in 2005, the subtitle to the painting read, 7 Aksakals are on their way. When I came back in 2008, yes, the subtitle was changed. It now read, 7 Khans are on their way. So someone in the museum administration had decided that it should not be average elders anymore, but elders of nobility who were visiting Manas. This is an emphasis on the stratification of Kyrgyz society, where indeed in the past you had hereditary leaders called manaps, but where axarchals in their function as lineage elders were as important on the local level as a manap was on a regional level. Of course, I asked one of the members of the staff why the sign had been changed, and of course the woman said it has not been changed, it has always been like this. The epic itself has traditionally been recited orally only by the so-called jomokchu, dreamers, to whom the epos is delivered in their dreams and who can recite only once they've entered a state of trance. During Soviet times, these men were referred to as manaschis, so the tellers of the Manas epic. It was also during Soviet times that next to the codification of customary law, which I was working on mostly, the codification of this oral epic took place in the name of nation building and the development of a distinct Kyrgyz identity that was to be defined through culture. During Soviet times, this move was frowned upon by the Jomokchus, also in the general population. And during the very first years of my fieldwork, and even before when I was a student at the American University in 2003, this was very much heavily criticized by the Jomokchus, whom I knew and from whom I learned Kyrgyz partly. So they did not like the Manas epic being written down at all. By now there are numerous versions of the epic in Kyrgyz as well as all kinds of other languages. And my friend, the Jomokchu, has even written his own PhD dissertation about the epic. There are contests among school children, and special afternoon schools have opened where the recital of the epic is being transmitted from an older generation to a younger one. At all national holidays, children will recite the epic, and so will the Jomokchu I'm friends with. So there has been a huge change within very few years in how Kyrgyz themselves relate to the codification of the epic, or the move basically from something which has only been, or traditionally only been orally narrated, to the production of text. Moreover, I show in my publications that in Kyrgyz politics, textual artifacts are employed. Material objects, for example, here you can see the Kyrgyz constitution as a textual artifact which is plastered on the outside of the prosecutor's office in Bishkek. And interestingly, this constitution had been spared during the 2010 coup d'etat. So it was basically the only thing that was left intact, whereas the whole building had been burned down in the course of the coup d'etat. So this is a textual artifact. Yeah? It's a material object displayed on a wall. So texts as thus are never a substitute for orality or in juxtaposition to it, but they often re-emphasize its meaning. So my argument is there's a connection between all of the little narratives of how descent, for example, is being talked about during a spring festival, how it is depicted in a genealogical chart in a local museum, how it gets talked about within the lineages, for example, also by professional sanjarachi, the tellers of the genealogies, or during national political campaigns, and how it is rendered official and textual or being turned into an artifact. All of this is connected. If we want to understand descent as one of the grand narratives, for example, that have shaped Kyrgyzstan before, during, and after the Soviet Union up until nowadays, we need to start with listening to how, where, and by whom these narratives are put in place and understand the conditions under which they change. Finally, in addition, we have numerous, uncountable individual life histories. These too have become very much en vogue in Kyrgyzstan since independence. Many of my informants have begun to either write down their life histories themselves, or they have relatives writing them for them. This happens usually while people are busy doing other things, for example, drinking tea or doing needlework. They will sit in their living rooms or outdoors. There will be people coming and going. It will be very informal and chaotic and not at all structured. The life histories that have been produced in this way can often only be found in people's private houses, in their bookshelves and in the living rooms. Sometimes they're just printed on sheets of paper for the relatives to read. Mostly they are textual artifacts too, not meant for reading, but for possessing. They tell the story of one's having told one's story. During my field research, my research assistant Zemfira and I became the writers of such a life history ourselves by writing down what Beyer had told me over the course of almost 2 years of field research. And she's my classificatory grandmother, so to speak, whose hands you see here in the picture. And the outcome of this endeavor is a small Kyrgyz language book like this, and I can give this around. And Beyer was definitely one of the most important persons for me, not only because I lived on a house within the compound of her household, not because she is by now 90 years old and had this remarkable life, but because she had acquired a status and a respect within the village I was working in that made it very easy for me to, on the one hand, come to her with my questions, which I still had, but on the other hand, just hanging out in her living room because the village would basically come to her house. So that it was never empty. And for her it was easy and entertaining. For her Kilin, for the daughter-in-law, it was hell, yeah, as everyone working in Central Asia knows. So she was constantly busy with making tea and cooking food and cleaning up. But for me, it was really an ideal situation. So here you can see her and Kuraber Genata, whom you've met, who is not a parrot. And he's looking into another book which I published after my fieldwork. It's a photo ethnography, which I brought back to my field site as a way to say thank you for everything these people had done for me. And this is part of her extended family. And so here she is correcting the life history, or the first draft of the life history, which I had brought back to her the year after we had worked on this together. So she made the final corrections, whereas her neighbor is looking at this other book which I made. And these two books basically were for me a way to reciprocate for all the help I had received, and then I wrote my dissertation. So I was very lucky to have doctoral supervisors who let me do these things first, because I really thought that was important. But something else happened with this book. It was printed in Kyrgyzstan, and 500 copies of them were distributed in village schools and local libraries. And this is a school in Amanbayevo, so all on the other side of Talas, where I knew people as well. And so stacks of, I think, 25 copies each are now being used in local history lessons. So basically the pupils in elementary school are reading this book and learning about what does it mean to have been raised, grown up, worked, prayed throughout the Soviet Union by a member of their community, by someone who is from the same region or even from the same village. Yeah, so and for me it was really fruitful to see that this is something which people really cherished, and I was glad to have been able to realize this. So to conclude, I started my talk with speaking about the art of listening. Listening can be described as a way of being sideways or of being alongside. It is a form of Mitsein, and as such not hierarchical but egalitarian. Oral history, the way I understand it, is defined not so much through its technicalities of gathering or storing or analyzing data. Neither does it serve to lend marginalized people a voice or even give them their voice back. It is more a technique of translation than it is a technique of documentation. Because what has been said are accounts of another person's self, that the other, a listener, needs to make sense of by drawing on her sense-making capacities, her own cultural background, and what she has already learned about the society and the context in which the oral history has been narrated. The American cultural anthropologist Michael Herzfeld suggested speaking about ethnographic biography instead of oral history. But I think there are two important reasons why anthropologists and historians should not change the vocabulary, but rather work together and alongside each other in further developing oral history as both a method and a theory of translation, whose main focus should be on listening. One reason is people do not tell stories, they tell their history. The This is their emic perspective. For them, it is not just one among many stories. It's the only story they want to tell, the only story they have. It's their way of framing their own life and their sense-making of it. That this is not history with a capital H is well known, but it needs to be taken seriously as it is. Second reason, I think it's important to stick to the concept of orality, which qualifies the particular type of history we're talking about. Orality continues to be of utmost importance even when the codification of narratives, as I've described in the case of Kyrgyzstan, has become important. In order to be written down, all the events I recalled here need to be narrated first. And once narrated and written down, they do not cease to be told. By introducing the concept of the textual artifact, I've tried to make clear that texts are often turned into material objects that can be referred to in talk and are not consulted for their content, for what is written in them, but for what they stand for. My example has been the Kyrgyz constitution, but we can think of many other examples. For example, the supersized golden statue of the Book of Ruhnama in Turkmenistan. Finally, it might be worth investigating or contemplating in what ways the problem of forgetting one's history or of not being heard is not so much a problem of our informants, but rather a problem of the scholars interested in oral history and of the way academia functions more generally. Scholarly knowledge that is not written down can rarely be accessed. Maybe the fact that oral history research has so much focused on its technical aspects has less to do with the way our informants remember or forget, and more with the methodological insecurities of our own, that we consider valid knowledge only what has been fixed and codified. Thus, we do not value little narratives in academia, only grand ones. However, the codification of a narrative is always a de- and a recontextualization of the actual talk. Audio files and the textual documents that derive from them are something entirely new, namely their talk, which are only identical with themselves, as the German sociologist Stefan Hirschauer called it. He said, what looks like the conservation of a process is only a biographical or historical snapshot. Recordings and the subsequent codification of narratives can also take the possibility away from the narrators to continuously define anew what something means to them. Everything they told can now be used in theory against them. Finally, in a lecture at the University of Zurich entitled Die verlorene Schrift, which needs to be understood both as the lost text as well as the lost script, the anthropologist Michael Opitz, who's most famous for his work on shamanism, has compared several narratives of people without script. And he reminds the listener that des peuples sans écriture was the qualification of the Laboratoire d'Anthropologie Sociale at the Collège de France when Lévi-Strauss founded it in 1960. So these were the people who lived at the margins of powerful states with a century-long history of written culture, such as China, Tibet, Siam, Myanmar, India, and Nepal. The focus of these narratives, which he collected from other anthropologists' work for the sake of his lecture, was that they all deal with the ways and reasons that these people had lost their original script. All of them, so the narratives go, had once had a script and knew how to write, but they lost it in various ways. Sheep ate it, cows swallowed it, dogs tore it apart, fish took it down into the water, birds carried it up into the sky, demons stole it. Opitz says that ethnographers, when they're engaging in fieldwork, are like pearl divers, whereas those scholars who are working with these narratives at home, thus with the gathered pearls, who compare narratives from different cultural contexts, just as he did in his lecture, are like jewelers. What was found by one is put together by another. How the jewelers arranges the pearls for a necklace, for example, in what order, which colors she chooses, what style she likes, will decide on the kind of jewelry that is being made, each single pearl symbolizing a narrative. Opitz reminds us, and as such, these pearls, these narratives, have the capacity to be used in new ways and to connect with others, to form something anew. Changing one pearl, one little narrative, as I called it here, will have an impact on a grand narrative. Thank you very much.